Inference Plus Story Short Number 3, Series A. Nobody liked Mrs. Michael Jessup Kramer. Nobody. Not the members of the Women's Auxiliary, not the social committee of the Ladies' Club, not even the daughters of the founders of Dairyville, and they let store owners' wives and daughters in. When a haberdasher's niece could get more names on her dance card than an oil titan's wife, it pointed to an alarming social imbalance. The woman was a pariah, and deservedly so. Everything about her made Mrs. John Tierney Devons shudder. Her hats were too big, her understanding of social graces was too small, and then there was the incident with the jar of raspberry jam at last year's Women's Auxiliary tea. Good Lord! It was unspeakable even 8 months later. Nevertheless, she had to be invited. Her husband was a wealthy, powerful man, and leaving her off the guest list of ladies' club events could be catastrophic, though perhaps not as catastrophic as the time she wore a morning gown to an afternoon charity croquet tournament. And she didn't even have the good sense to be embarrassed. When Mrs. John Tierney Devons had helpfully pointed out the faux pas, Mrs. Michael Jessup Kramer had simply laughed and made a joke about silly social customs. The audacity! What was next? Serving tomato juice before 11 in the morning? White shoes after Labor Day? Using the same fork for the salad and the appetizer courses? Metal caviar spoons? Where would it end, this hellish madness? Mrs. Devons didn't know, and she hoped she would never have to find out. At the monthly homemakers' brunch, Mrs. Michael Jessup Kramer once again presented a spectacle in a yellow satin frock, despite satin being an evening fabric and yellow being a color far too garish for such a subdued event. Mrs. John Tierney Devons was filled with despair. Women like Mrs. Michael Jessup Kramer were tearing apart the very fabric of decent society. She sighed with resignation as she stirred the white powder into Mrs. Michael Jessup Kramer's tea. There was simply nothing else to be done.